Good morning and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. We're a research center at Harvard University that serves as the hub for the Kennedy School's research, teaching, and training in the human rights domain. We embrace a dual mission to provide students and the next generation of leaders education in human rights policy and practice, and to convene and provide policy relevant knowledge to international organizations, governments, policymakers, and businesses. It's really my honor and privilege to welcome you today, several hundred of you from around the world, to join us in a conversation with two leading scholars. We're going to be talking about the struggle for Black lives, historical legacies to future possibilities. The tragic killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and Breonna Taylor in Louisville has sparked protests both around the country, but also in different countries around the world. We're going to be talking about the history of racist policing in the United States, the killing of Black people by vigilantes and police, the role of the civil rights movement and other social movements in advocating for change. And finally, we'll talk about ways in which we can envision a more just future. We're going to hear first from Dr. Keisha N. Blaine, who's an award-winning historian of the 20th century United States. She specialized in African-American history, the modern African diaspora, and women's and gender studies. Her research interests include Black internationalism, radical politics, and global feminisms. She's an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh and president of the African-American Intellectual History Society. She's currently a W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow at Harvard University. We'll next hear from Megan Ming Francis, who's a visiting associate professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and associate professor of political science at the University of Washington. She specializes in the study of American politics with broad interests in criminal punishment, Black political activism, philanthropy, and the post-Civil War South. Once we hear from both of them, I'm going to ask some questions, and we welcome questions from the audience through the chat function. And we will do a combination of questions from the audience and a dialogue with our two speakers. So welcome to all of you, and I'm going to turn it over now to Keisha.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I just want to offer a couple of remarks just in an attempt to contextualize some of the developments that are taking place currently. I think many people at this moment are drawing parallels to the civil rights movement, to the modern civil rights movement, particularly focusing on the 1960s and 1970s moment. And that certainly makes a lot of sense. What is interesting is that we see, for example, some pundits, even politicians, making an argument that some of the developments taking place today, the current protests and uprisings, are actually somewhat deviating from the civil rights movement, that they are deviating from the goals of the civil rights movement, that activists are engaged in the kinds of activities that take away from the overall mission and purpose of the civil rights movement. And we hear over and over again individuals quoting, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., and in order to use his words as a way to pacify activists, as a way to even delegitimize activists on their efforts to bring attention to the issue of police violence and brutality, and particularly police killings in this country. And so there are a couple of things that I want to emphasize today, and I think we'll end up discussing a lot of this a bit later. The first is that it's important to remember that the issue of police violence and brutality is not divorced from the larger narrative of the civil rights movement. And what do I mean? Well, I always point people back to the 1963 famous I Have a Dream speech that Martin Luther King gave at the March on Washington, of which he actually called out police violence and brutality. I'm just quoting briefly. He said, "There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied?" And he continues, "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." That is a line that appears in his famous speech, which I believe many people either are unaware or they certainly don't emphasize. And that is a problem, because we need to shine the light on the fact that what we are discussing today in this moment, following the police killings of George Floyd, as well as Brianna Thomas, as well as Tony McDade in the last few weeks, that these are all connected issues. They're all connected concerns. And focusing on police violence and brutality is not a deviation. It actually is very much a part of a larger conversation, an extended conversation about civil rights and citizenship rights in this country. So that's the one thing I would emphasize. I would also point to Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer, as many of you know, from the state of Mississippi, is someone who came into politics pretty late in her life. She was already close to age 50 when she became part of the movement, mentored by someone like Ella Baker, and certainly working closely with activists in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Fannie Lou Hamer in 1964 gave this televised speech. It was very popular, certainly caught a lot of people's attention at the time, and we certainly talk about the speech today, in which she addressed a number of issues. Certainly spoke about voting rights, pointed out the challenges that Black people encountered in the South, the limitations to the vote, their inability to cast a ballot simply because of white supremacy, violence, efforts to curtail the vote, despite the fact that they should have been able to vote as guaranteed by the US Constitution. But one of the things that's actually quite critical about that speech in '64, which I think about now more than ever, is that Fannie Lou Hamer used the opportunity to talk about police violence and brutality, and to talk about it broadly, not just in terms of what was taking place in her community, what she witnessed in the South and across the country, but to zoom in on her personal experience. And so Fannie Lou Hamer was with a group of activists traveling in the South, again, working toward voting, encouraging others to register to vote. And she finds herself in this very unfortunate situation, which in many ways, one can see the parallels to a more recent example, for example, like the Sandra Bland case. A police, she has this encounter with the police. Police officers actually drag her and several other activists into the station. Fannie Lou Hamer goes into this lengthy discussion at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, in which she talks about how she's brutally beaten. And this is a very painful moment for her. And it's one in which I think she ultimately talks about it, because she's trying to get people to understand that you can't talk about Black rights, Black freedom, without seeing how all these issues are connected. So on the one hand, yes, we have to push for voting rights. But what she's saying is we have to be able to vote, but we also have to be able to live our lives. We have to be able to walk the streets. We have to be able to go from place to place and not worry about the fact that we could simply lose our lives because of the color of our skin. We have to be able to have these kinds of encounters with police that doesn't result in someone being killed. And so in that example, I think it's, as well as the early example I emphasized with Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, it's important to see how all these issues are connected. And so this is where I would encourage us in this moment to push back against the kinds of narratives that we hear that try to shame activists for the work that they're doing, and we can get into conversations about many of the things that are taking place at the moment. Yes, people are looting. Yes, we see acts of violence taking place. Yes, we see destruction of property. But what I find is that these issues become distractions, if you will, in that we often focus on these things without grappling with the larger issue, which I think is about civil rights, and it's not disconnected from the earlier civil rights movement that we love to glorify and even romanticize. I think it's important for us to perhaps see what's taking place today as part of a larger continuum, and to see it as actually extending the work of Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, and others who wanted to ensure that Black people would have full rights, full freedom in this country. So that's all I'll say for now, and I'm happy to elaborate further.
Thank you so much, Keisha. I was struck with your closing remarks where you talk about the narratives to shame or delegitimize. And I wanted to just flag something I had raised in an earlier webinar, which we had co-hosted with the Center for African Studies on the rise of xenophobia and discrimination, which is that when there were protests to reopen the economy in the United States, when in the wake of coronavirus, many of these rallies and protests involved people who are white nationalists who were claiming the language of civil rights and claiming the language of being oppressed in order to demand their right to be able to move with freedom, etc. So we're seeing both the co-optation of this language as well as the delegitimization of people's struggles. So thank you for that. Megan, I'm going to turn it over to you and then we'll have our conversation.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So first, just a few opening remarks, and then I'm going to try to do basically a 10-minute civil rights lesson. And I'm probably not going to be able to do it justice, but I'm going to try. First, I really want to thank Shushma and the Carr Center for hosting this and for responding so quickly to this urgent issue. I also really want to thank my co-panelists, even though we're not here in person, Keisha Blaine, and for extraordinary work with the African American Intellectual Society and for creating a space for the amplification of so much important scholarship. So if you out there are looking for a place to read and to learn, highly recommend that you go there. And then also to the audience, for those who are tuning in wherever you are tuning in, I really want to acknowledge and just underscore one of the things I often tell my students, especially in dealing with difficult issues, is that my hope really, my main hope is that you survive. And I think that, like, for me, at least, that advice and that word is so important in this moment. I think over the last few days, myself, as so many of my academic colleagues, have been struggling and trying to understand how to manage media requests, how to manage deadlines, important writing deadlines, family responsibilities. And I think it's easy to feel overburdened. And so I just really want to kind of focus on the survival through this moment. So I'm going to say that. I will also say, and this is the last kind of opening remark that I'll give, is that if this is surprising, if what has happened in terms of the killing, the murder of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, if this is surprising as well as the protests that have happened, then you need to ask yourself why it is so surprising. Because Black people have been in the streets and they have been shouting this in workplaces and in academic institutions and on the streets for many, many years. So we need to ask ourselves, I think, that question about why is this surprising? I think that's a really important question to sit with. And then what is our responsibility to do better? And then we need to educate ourselves and act. I think one of the things that always, for me, jumps out about the current moment is that there is this quote that Brian Stevenson says about that part of the reason why that we're unable to move past our very violent racial history is because we don't know it. Right, that part of actually getting to, I think, the place where everybody wants to get to is understanding that. But everybody wants to get to a place where it's much better without kind of wrestling with the demons of our history's past. And so in my remaining time that I have, I'm going to try to do that. So the work that I do in political science and sometimes in interloper in political history is focused on early 20th century Black political movements, specifically the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but I actually want to jump even further back in time to my current book project, which actually examines the convict leasing system and basically the rise of the criminal punishment system after the Civil War in Texas and in Alabama. So I'm really interested in the South, at least, about how we have kind of these small prison or jail populations. And then what you see at the end of the 19th century is really big, expanding very quickly of jail populations, of the building of huge penitentiaries all across the South. And so one of the things that I've been doing over the past 2 months has really been digging deep into the archives, specifically of Texas right now. And what you see is that, right, so the Civil War ends and like the South was not like, oh, you know what, we love emancipation, right? Obviously, no. And so what they are doing in the first legislature, when the first legislature meets in Texas, is they are already thinking about the ways to roll back the freedoms like of emancipation, right? And this is before Reconstruction, as Reconstruction is being built, right? So the South, the people in control of power, of political, legal, and economic power in the South are already thinking about how to roll that back. And the ways that they do, and there's so much wonderful history about this terrible moment, is through Black codes. And so one of the ones that a number of my colleagues have pointed to is the Curfew Law or the Vagrancy Law. And so they passed these laws really as the dust was settling after the Civil War. And then they practiced what we know, of course, is discriminatory policing, right? So it was these seemingly race-neutral laws, but the concerns have always been in terms of, especially around kind of the development of the South, has been about how do we maintain a specific type of racial order that has white people at the top and Black people at the bottom, as well as how do we maintain a specific type of economic system that has Black people continue to work for us. And their way, at least kind of their temporary solve to that, was to pass these new laws and then to police them in discriminatory ways, right? So I just want to kind of like frame up in terms of especially a Southern type of policing force through that lens. And what's really interesting about this earlier period is now where we have a type of kind of colorblind language. In that earlier period, they straight up say what it is, right? Because they're like, racism doesn't exist. Their worlds exist. So they are very open about what they are actually doing. So I actually think we can learn a lot from that earlier period. But moving forwards, the NAACP is formed in 1909, and they are formed around this issue about racial violence. And that's in part because of what Keisha talks about in the article in the Washington Post, is about the work of Ida B. Wells and really raising this issue of lynching and mob violence, and that like the state should do something, and that we need to pay attention to the murder of Black people by white vigilantes and by the state. So the NAACP, they picked this up, and they basically, in terms of the first 2 decades of the organization's existence, is all about a fight around racial violence. They really truly believe that racial violence is the first civil right, that before African Americans can vote, before African Americans can go to school, they have to live. Right. And so there's this meeting minutes, I believe it's like 1916, 1917, when one of the white NAACP board members basically poses this question about why doesn't the NAACP focus on other areas that today we associate with civil rights? And one of the Black NAACP board members responds, all the American Negro wants is a chance to live without a rope around his neck. And in 2020, that's still the case. But the NAACP is there, and they are advocating. They form campaigns in the streets to raise the issue, to try to change the hearts and minds of Americans. They also know that you have to work inside institutions, and so they tried to pass an anti-lynching bill in Congress. They tried again. This is always what I think is always crazy, right? They tried to persuade Woodrow Wilson and Warren G. Harding to make statements condemning lynching. Both presidents actually do, as well as this dramatic, important case in front of the Supreme Court called Moore v. Dempsey. And it's this dramatic case in criminal procedure. But I think what's really interesting about this issue is that the NAACP, working at the beginning of the 20th century, sees that, and it's not just like a few NAACP members, that a lot of people, and there's this a number of really great, beautiful, powerful pictures of the silent protest parade that I've been seeing floating around in 1917 of when 10,000 African Americans marched down Fifth Ave in New York City, protesting violence in East St. Louis, which happened over basically a labor dispute. So here's the NAACP working around this issue of racial violence. What we know for sure, and this is one of the things that I always tell my students, is that it doesn't go away. Right? If you really understand the history of this country, racial violence is everywhere. When some of my friends are so surprised, I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know. I can't point to a period of American history in which state and white vigilantes were not killing Black folk, right? And that doesn't mean that it always has to happen. But we have to understand that is a part of our history, and we always have to ask ourselves, how can we make that not the case? And something that I woke up thinking about today, I tweeted about, was about like, how do we actually make Black lives matter? I'm going to jump forward because I think I have maybe like 4 minutes. I don't know. But in terms of, we move forward very quickly, in terms of what Keisha was saying, that a lot of people right now have been paying attention to and have been pointing kind of historical parallels between the 1960s and now, is Black people still, right, again, still concerned about this issue around violence. It's always state violence and private violence, right? And the way in which the state operates. And I also really want to underscore that for many Black communities, police have never served a legitimate force in their communities. So here it is in terms of the 1960s, different groups protesting, part of different movements as well. One of the ones that I kind of always talk to about my students is the Black Panther Party. And there's such an understanding in the Bay Area about how the police didn't actually protect and serve, that they protect and served some people, right, and not others. And so what Black Panthers did, is they formed their own kind of community policing force. And so they surveilled, the police surveilling Black people in their communities, right, as a way to make sure and to try to lessen the level of police brutality that is going on. I say that to say that I think one of the things that's really interesting about that we've, at least a lot of us have seen over the past few years, is the different type of community strategies that people are forming because they feel abandoned by the state, right? And so especially a lot of Black women activists are trying to figure out what types of different types of community care, response to violence actually exist in communities and organizing people. And so the last few minutes that I have here, it's not just the story around police violence, around the killings, the murder of African Americans, of Black people in this country, we don't have to continue always that story, that there have been attempts. That sometimes I talk to people and they're like, Megan, it's so overwhelming. I'm like, oh, okay. Imagine being Black, right? Like there's no days off, you know? So, but there has been work. And like, if our imagination cannot allow us to think about what else types of organizing are actually happening, then we're not listening to the right voices. And we need to expand who we listen to. We need to expand what we actually read. But that there are other types of political constitution and policy making out there. And we need to learn about those. But I think that part of the process of learning is also unlearning. That so many of us have been conditioned in this country in terms of a romantic vision of civil rights, and we really need to blow that up. It's been clear, one of the things that has been so clear is that Black people have been articulating a different vision of democracy, of institutional accountability for a very long time, and that we need to pay much more attention to that. And I think that this is exciting. I mean, I'll end on a hopeful note, maybe. I don't have to, though. But I think that this is, in some ways, a terrible moment, but I've actually never seen some of the responses from Black people, as well as from people from outside of the Black community, and wanting different ideas and different strategies about what to do about the present. For so many people, they've been kind of holding on, right? Maybe we can reform it on the edges. But for a lot of people right now, I have been seeing people say that this does not work, and what else is actually out there. And so I've seen kind of this opening, at least of people's imagination, to think about what other forms kind of institutional arrangements that actually value the community and the people that are in these communities much more. And that has been exciting. The very last thing I'll say is on that point is that you see, at least in the press, so many interesting articles, right, that talk about what a different vision might look like, that shine light on activists and community members that have been doing this work for a very long time, that like openly in mainstream news talk about defunding the police, that talk about demilitarization, something that I actually didn't think that I would see in the next 5 years. But here we are. So I guess I will end there, but there's been so many people that have influenced even for me, my thinking about what is possible. So I really encourage people, if they feel stuck in this moment, just to expand the reading list. I'll end there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Megan. I just wanted to share an observation and then something from Megan's Twitter feed for everyone. And if you are not following Megan and Keisha on Twitter, you should. That's how I met both of them. And I learned something new every day. So, your remarks at the beginning about the development of laws like the Curfew Law and Vagrancy Law and the ways in which these were then utilized to enforce supposedly a neutral law and order approach, but really was a discriminatory in nature, reminds me really of colonial rule, where oftentimes the British introduced laws, which are still on the books, sedition laws, anti-national laws, and ways in which people were policed to ensure that they did not foment rebellion. And now increasingly governments are utilizing those laws to suppress democracy and freedom of speech. So it was particularly striking to me. So I wanted to share this post that Megan shared this morning. She said, woke up this morning thinking about the mattering of Black lives and the ways Black people twist themselves to matter in white worlds to survive, and how that burden must shift. Part of the repair that is needed that people can work on is the mattering of Black lives. How do you show up at work and in your community to make Black lives matter? Do you challenge yourselves to deconstruct racist institutions and to hold space for people with less power? If not, start today. So I thought that was really powerful, and it really kind of connected us as individuals being part of institutions, whether it's our workplaces or religious institutions or institutions of civil society, and how do we push the institutions that we are part of to reflect on their own privilege and power and open up space for others. So I'm going to maybe turn back to you, Keisha, to perhaps just reflect back on some of the thoughts that Megan has shared, and also perhaps to talk about the roles of institutions as we look forward, ways in which we can think of, creating a more just space. And maybe I'll have both of you reflect on that, because part of what we'd like to do is not just point a finger at the problem or the history, but really kind of co-create a future.
Yeah, so I would reiterate, just emphasize what Megan mentioned earlier about reading and just trying to open up our minds to the possibilities. I think what I find is when we have conversations about even just American policing, people get very uncomfortable when we begin to start questioning whether the notion of reform even makes sense. I think there's generally this idea that, well, maybe all we need to do is tweak something. Maybe all we need to do is ensure that there's more training. Maybe all we need to do is to make sure that officers go through some sort of routine, and then maybe it's about diversity training. Maybe it's about meeting members of the community. So we always take those kinds of approaches, and I get it, because part of what happens is when we have these conversations, we're trying to make sense of what's happening, but we're also trying to make sure that we're taking steps that somehow make us feel comfortable. We want change, but we want comfortable kind of change. We want the kind of change that we can sort of ease into. And I caution people against that, because of course we were talking about the civil rights movement. We love to romanticize the civil rights movement today, but the truth is, at the time, people saw it as quite radical. And there was a lot of conversation about gradualism. Well, wait. People would say, wait, you're pushing too fast. Must you actually push yourself into a restaurant and demand to be served? Hold on a minute. Why don't we just talk about it? And must you show up in the streets and lead all these marches and point in our faces the fact that you don't have rights? Maybe we can have conversations some more. And I know that these are broad kinds of comparisons, but I emphasize that because I think we have to move away from comfortability. What does that mean? It means actually having a conversation about, as Megan said, defunding the police, for example, or actually having a conversation of getting rid of an entire system and imagining new possibilities. That is scary for a lot of people. I get it, but if we keep doing the same thing over and over again, we can't expect different results, right? And so at some point we have to do something quote unquote radical. At some point we have to say, all right, we tried the diversity training, we tried meeting the community and holding hands and and all of these things that seem wonderful at the surface. But here we are in 2020 talking about George Floyd, talking about Brianna Thomas, talking about Tony McDade. Just a few years ago, we were talking about Mike Brown. Just a few years ago, we were talking about Trayvon Martin. We were talking about, the list goes on and on. We could, in the 90s, we were talking about Fannie Lou Hamer. We were talking about Amadou Diallo. So you notice a pattern, right? And so what has changed? Well, some things have changed, but clearly those changes have not been effective to actually dismantle the system. So why don't we open up ourselves to the possibility? Pick up Angela Davis, pick up, there's just a list of authors I can recommend. I just put together a reading list for those of you who might be interested from this magazine. Take a look at all women authors. Just, be open to the possibility. It may take some time, but I just think being resistant and lifting up your hands and saying, no, these approaches are far too difficult, far too radical, is exactly what allows us to be in the same place and exactly why we're stuck in the same place over and over again.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask a question which draws a bit on Megan's work, which is on institutions that then, whether it's funding or it's external pressures or it's boards, tend to become more cautious or risk averse in their approaches. And so there becomes a lot of sort of, dumbing down of agendas, right? So how do you find a way to stay true to mission and purpose and to ensure that you stay focused? I'm saying this coming from, the world of philanthropy for many years and now being in, academia, which is kind of has a very, very similar dynamic. So how do you ensure that institutions and leaders can stay focused on, for example, the initial focus of the NAACP around racial violence, and then the agenda setting over time has changed based on different agendas of external stakeholders. So how do you manage that?
Oh, those are good questions. I'm gonna get to that. I really want to underscore something that Keisha said that I think is so important, that is getting lost in social media right now, which is really about the heterogeneity of Black struggle, right? That there's seemingly this one story that has come out, which is what everybody learned in elementary school in this country around Black people and what a rights movement is. It's like the short, compact. It's not even 54 to 68, right? It's like 60 to 64 or 65, right? And that it's like Martin Luther King, which we've seen all the quotes, and he's an incredible and such an important figure. But we also, in terms of there's so many more people, and also in terms of the impossibility of what was going on at the time, right? That you have Martin Luther King, and one of the things that I always assign to my students is a letter from a Birmingham jail, right? Where he calls on, right, these white moderates about your weight has actually always meant a Black never. Right? And that there's all these different moments if one actually really gets into it and studies that history about how Black people were thinking about the movement and different strategies. And they were all part of producing kind of what we get in 64 and 65 and 68. And so kind of the sanitized version that hits my timeline a bit too much right now. I would like us to dispense with that, right? Because I think that we can hold so-called nonviolence and so-called violence at the same time. Right, I believe in us that we can do that. I believe that we can expand our understanding of civil rights leaders outside of MLK. I think that we can embrace other people, as Fannie Lou Hamer, as Ella Baker, to understand their organizing as well. Something that I saw, to quote Twitter again from Christina Sharp, was that she said, I think it was a quote about, I keep thinking about the impossibility of the Haitian Revolution as it was happening. Right? That things that seem impossible at the moment actually can happen through an organized and energized and people who actually care, right? But I think that one of the things that has actually held us back so much in actually fighting for and thinking about what a different future might look like is kind of the way that the political and legal systems actually work right now. But to this question here that you've raised, which is about kind of how do we, corporate boards and or philanthropic or nonprofit boards, how might you push people, individuals to do a bit more on these issues, right? I think that's difficult. I think that, I mean, one of the things that I have spent far too much time on today is thinking about Mark Zuckerberg and how he used up time of very powerful, important civil rights leaders, right? Had a phone call about what is going on around the non-censoring of Trump, right? On the platform. You had Facebook, people who work there, who care, who love their jobs, right? Walk out yesterday. And then of course you have CZI, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative on so-called criminal justice issues, right? So it's like, so we also need to talk about kind of what does an actual commitment to these issues actually mean, right? So like everybody, I mean, one of the things I was like, I was exhausted. All the corporate endorsements yesterday of Black Lives Matter and condemning of what happened. Okay, so why does your corporate board, why does it look all white? You literally are saying by who you have on your board and what your leadership looks like, that Black lives actually don't matter to you, right? So I need people to do a lot of internal work. I think there's so much like window dressing that happens in corporations, in philanthropy, and don't get me started on academia, right? So there's so much that happens, and there's not enough internal reflection about what does it mean to make Black Lives Matter where you are right now, without all the applause, right? And to do that work. So I'll end there.
Well, and I want to just quickly jump in, because I do want to say something about higher ed just for a moment. I've been following all of these beautifully crafted statements being released by university presidents across the nation, and I'm certainly keeping track of all of these, because I'm hoping that all of these statements actually suggest that we are going to start seeing changes actually taking place on college campuses. If you're a university president and you're releasing a powerful statement of which you are even alluding to the fact that Black Lives Matter, then show it. Show that Black Lives Matter through the creation of tenure track and tenured lines. Go ahead and show how much you believe Black Lives Matter when you make decisions about tenure, when you make decisions about the Black scholars that are on your campus, and the kinds of resources that you provide and the kinds of support that you provide or not. Let's move from rhetoric and lovely crafted statements to actual policies and actual changes. So I just, I think in this moment, for as much as I think these statements are meaningful, I would hope that they are just beginning and not the end.
Yes, absolutely. I think that there's so much work to be done, across sectors, and we have to think about how it just doesn't become a photo op, So coming back to some of the audience questions that are here, I'm going to start with a question that looks at the role of technology companies. So, we focused on the role of the police and talking about police accountability, but really, what are your thoughts about social media companies and their accountability? Whether it's information that's being posted on their platforms or broader trends in the ways in which technology is being utilized to conduct surveillance on Black and Brown communities. How do we take a step back and think about the institutions and sectors that we hold accountable, and where does technology fit into this narrative? Either of you.
I'll take a quick pass at this. I'm gonna take a quick pass at this, but I'm gonna start by saying Shushma has written a book that has come out this year, and I would very much like to hear from her on this issue around surveillance. So surveillance and race is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. There's so much, I think, critical work on that issue right now that is so important. But in terms of this responsibility of technology companies, I think that there is a responsibility. I think one of the things right now that we've seen is kind of an abdication of responsibility, right? That here is this neutral platform, and it can be used in bad ways, but it's mostly for good, right? And oftentimes the way that surveillance is kind of sold to the public is of convenience and safety, right? But I think that technology companies, and this is something that I've learned from others, Ruha Benjamin being somebody who has taught me so much about race, surveillance, and technology, is that we really need to be mindful of the responsibility of these companies about how their platforms will be used by others. And I do think that especially technology companies need to be clear about who they are and what their values are as a company. Because one of the things that is clear, right, about in this current moment is that it doesn't work, that silence and neutrality doesn't exist. It's actually complicity, right? So what do you actually care about and to do something about it? All right, I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Megan. So I just wanted to say that actually that Ruha is in the audience. I wanted to say shout out to Ruha. We worship at your feet. We think you're incredible. And I just wanted to also flag for our listeners, Ruha's concept of, she talks about the new Jim Code, ways in which apps, as well as complex algorithms, have the ability to deepen discrimination, even while they appear neutral and even benevolent compared to racist practices of a previous era. So if you haven't read her book, Race After Technology, I'd highly recommend that. I do think this is an area where we do need to do more work. I think that there's been, sort of work in the human rights domain and the civil rights domain, and there's work that's happening in the technology space. And increasingly those sectors are intersecting, including at the Carr Center, where we have a program directed by our director, Matthias Rieser, that looks at the impact of technology on the human rights movement and on the human rights framework overall. And we examine issues such as algorithmic bias, the use of surveillance, both on Black and Brown communities in the US, but also elsewhere in the world, in places like Xinjiang and in North Korea. And we have a group of fellows doing amazing work in this regard. So I do think this is an area that we need to increasingly focus on. Our gaze has to be on the state and state accountability, local police, our national leaders, but also really thinking about private companies and their accountability, the ways in which money is made and the ways in which people benefit and are excluded from everything from job opportunities to housing to even ability to re-enter the workforce after a criminal conviction. So there's really sort of a new horizon for us as we think about rights in this sort of technological world. So there's a couple of more specific questions from the audience, and we've talked about defunding police. So somebody asked, what are the best tactics for defunding police? And I'm not sure if there are specific organizations you can recommend we learn more about, or policy proposals in this area. Either.
Okay, I'll start. So in terms of defunding the police, I think that there's a lot of different attempts and organizing happening in different places across the country. One of the ones that I focused on in the class that I taught this past semester at the Kennedy School was something small, not small, it's actually really, really big, which is to end cash bail. This is, I think, one example. I think one of the things that I saw on social media this week was, there's all these bail campaigns? Isn't this money just going into this capitalist criminal punishment system that we have right now? Yes, right, but Black people need to survive in the present moment, but we should also work towards how do we actually end the cash bail system. There has been also a number of different attempts about how do we, in terms of where you are. So for example, at the University of Washington, where I am a professor at, there is a petition and organizing going on about limiting the contract with Seattle Police Department, as well as disarming the police, right? And so thinking about kind of where you are, different ways to defund the police where you are. Maybe that is a security force, if it's a corporation. We are also seeing organizing in a lot of big cities around making sure that no more money is going towards the building of new jails, of new prisons. right? In terms of, this is also in my hometown in Seattle, about stopping the building of a youth jail. We saw this in terms of this so many protests, and I really want to highlight, because I did this as a case study, all the protests around Rikers and the closing of Rikers, and the many, many activists who came and said, you can't build new jails in the boroughs, right? That closing Rikers doesn't mean that you should then allocate $8 billion to the building, right? And so looking at what your kind of like your state and your city is doing in appropriating money towards policing jails and prisons and getting organized and stopping that. And not just stopping that, but also thinking about how do we then like move this money to people and groups who are actually doing the work around harm reduction, around accountability, right? And so some of the work, as we know, of course, is that police have responded to issues around mental illness. And that has been, for so many people, kind of the first response. And that should never be the case, right? And so funding people who work around mental illness, funding social services, funding housing, funding all these things that have not been funded at the same level of policing. And the last, at least right now, citation I really want to amplify is Elizabeth Hinton has written an incredible book called From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, which really touches how, in terms of the building up of the war of the state through Johnson's war on poverty, allowed for a greater role of police. So on there.
Terrific.
So I would like to also just quickly recommend a few things. Just again, as we're both, and Megan and I are both emphasizing the need to do more reading and to encourage people, if they have just an interest in the topic, to read more. And there's one piece that I found particularly useful that was published just this week, entitled "Defund the Police Now." It was published in the Appeal. Justin Brooks, who is a law student at UC Berkeley, wrote the piece, and I think it's, for those, it certainly provides a broad overview for emphasizing the way that we can push for making sure that we're spending less money on crime control, for example, and more so on social services. I would also point people to Black Lives Matter, blacklivesmatter.com/defund the police. They've included some great resources there, as well as just a general explainer, a way for, if you're interested in getting involved in the movement at the local level, at the national level. There are ways you can do that. So those are just some quick resources that come to mind that I think people may want to explore if they're interested in learning more.
Couple other questions. One is around sort of engagement with the international community and how they could be better leveraged for Black Lives Matter in the US. We've seen protests happening around the world, from New Zealand to Paris and elsewhere. What are your thoughts of connecting with broader global movements for solidarity?
So I think it's absolutely important that we do this, and we've seen the importance of it just even from a historical perspective. I think we've referenced King so many times, and one of the other parts of, I think, King's vision that people often de-emphasize is his internationalist vision, and the ways that he was not only thinking about developments taking place in the US, but also thinking about how to connect the struggles in the US with other developments taking place across the globe, especially at the time, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa being one example, certainly African liberation struggles of the 60s. And I think in this particular moment, we can certainly harness the power, I think, of international, transnational solidarities and networks to be able to do a couple of things. Well, on the one hand, as we know, in as much as these are national issues and they are, local issues and state issues, et cetera, these are certainly global issues. And of course, police violence and brutality is an issue in the United States, as it is in a place like, for example, Brazil, even, again, within Black communities being targeted by the police. So what does that mean? That means that we might think about ways to collaborate with activists in Brazil, coming up with the kinds of strategies and solutions that would not only address police violence in a national context, but in a global context. That's one thing. The other thing too is that I'm struck by even the way we're having conversations about recent developments, and recent uprisings. A lot of people have reached out to me, especially international media, and I often get questions like, tell me more about the racism that's taking place in the United States, and I'm happy to answer those questions. But oftentimes, I think people frame the question that way because they are probably imagining that they can point the finger and say, look what's happening in the U.S. It's so bad, those racial issues in the U.S. But I'm in the U.K. and things don't look so terrible. And so this is a moment where we can not only shed the light on what's happening in the U.S., but we can actually shed the light on what's happening in the U.K. So what I've often done is push the question back and say, do you really think there's no racism in the UK? Do you really think you don't have police brutality and violence in the UK? Well, let me tell you, I'm here, surprise. And so this is good because I think what it does is it gets people in other spaces to begin to look internally and recognize, if they don't see that there's a problem, recognize that one, that white supremacy is not defined by geographic borders, that it is a global issue. So hopefully in this moment, the kinds of international collaborations we form will get people to do that. And the other thing too is that the image of the United States, it matters. I mean, it matters when you are able to bring these issues to the fore, when you're able to bring it to a national audience. And we saw this historically. Sometimes it's only when an issue, made it to the United Nations did someone actually feel uncomfortable enough to do something about it. And in a similar way, I think it's good that we see international community coming together to shed the light on what is, as I said, not simply local, not simply state, not simply a national issue, but absolutely a global issue.
Can I just say two quick things about that? One, everything that Keisha says, yes, I wish I had my church fan over here. Absolutely. Especially in terms of history, right? That the way that Black activists and leaders have been thinking about the struggle here in the United States, from Ida B. Wells, right, going across the pond to the UK to raise support about this issue around about violence against Black bodies, lynching and mob violence, to Du Bois, right, to in terms of also, I mean, a lot of my work is internal documents in terms of the NAACP, but around thinking about what is going on in terms of the Haitian Revolution and that providing such an inspiration to Black people in the United States, right? So just in terms of kind of historically, that a lot of thinking about what might be possible here is influenced by connection to people, Black people internationally, globally, who are doing work. And just a last quick thing that it's so important in this present moment. One of the things that was really exciting about kind of the initial formation of Black Lives Matter is the different chapters all across the world and the importance of that, especially, and I know that a lot of Black Lives Matter activists talk about this, but the role of especially of Palestinian activists and talking about state violence and their ways that they were able, some of them, not all of them, were able to survive and cope, and through different strategies that they used was important. The very last thing I promised this time is I think it's really important to think about the global order in part because of the United States intervention, right, abroad in so many different places. And that role is done because of some idea of that we have a legitimate democracy, right? That we have law and order and a rule of law that actually works and that treats people equally, right? And so it's important for a lot of different reasons. And the last book recommendation, Mary Doziak has written an incredible book from the Cold War to Civil Rights that talks about kind of the role of the media as well as the global order and applying pressure to the United States to do better.
Terrific points. I actually imagine that the media headlines, if all of these events were happening in another country, would be that, the State Department is going to create a Marshall Plan, or that, there's going to be troops sent by some multilateral force to deal with some kleptocratic, autocratic ruler who is, oppressing a particular group. But it is something that we have to think carefully about as we think about, human rights around the world that, in fact, when I did international work and, when you're working for a large US foundation, one of the first questions I would get from people who are anti-human rights, government officials would be like, well, what are you guys doing about Native Americans or the plight of African Americans? And who are you to lecture us? How have you not addressed rights issues at home? Of course, they were, still going to oppress groups in their own countries, but it was very often a sort of a counterpoint to advancing rights concerns in their countries. So I know we're almost out of time, and I was wondering if, it's been a very heartbreaking, angering, sorrowful, difficult week for many of us, all of us. And I know that we have people on the call from around the world, people who are deeply steeped in this work, as well as people coming from academia or students and elsewhere. So I'm wondering if you can offer sort of a reflection for the future or something that we can take with us as we go forth and try and think about how do we bring change in the world, in our own communities and in our own institutions.
Well, one of the things that I would emphasize in this moment is that, and I think in many ways we already know this, but it's worth repeating, is that what we're fighting for at this moment may never be realized in our lifetime. And that's a scary thought, because I think many of us would agree that we would like to experience a life. Certainly, as a Black person in the United States, I would love to be able to experience a life without police violence and brutality, without police killings. I'd love to be able to walk the streets and not have to worry that maybe I could lose my life in that moment, just jogging or having a meal or reading a book because of the color of my skin. I do think that we have to even just look at the past and to remind ourselves that these things take time, and these things may not necessarily, change in the moment that we hope that it would. That can be discouraging, but I think we have to keep pushing, even if it seems like that it is a long road ahead. We have to keep demanding change. We have to recognize that every step we take, I believe, is an effort to chip away at systems of oppression. It's not easy to chip away at systems of oppression that has been fundamental to the United States, to the globe. I mean, it's a monumental task, but I think we have to just be mindful that every step that we take, every step forward, every effort that we make will matter. And if it doesn't necessarily matter for us in our lifetime, I am hopeful that it would matter for our children, for their children and their children. So I hope people take heart at this moment with everything that's going on, to somehow not lose hope.
Yeah, thank you. That's tough. I was like, oh, I hope Keisha takes this first. I will say that part of the thing that keeps me going. There was initially last week I did have a day where I was like, I'm not doing this. I'm exhausted. This keeps on happening. My work is on racial violence and Black political organizing, and I'm spent, right? But for me, in terms of, I think that thing that keeps me going, and that in which I find inspiration in is my students and teaching and talking to people. And one of the things that continues to fuel me is the possibility for people to change and to do something, right? That it's not enough to be like, I renounce white privilege. It's not enough to I'm gonna go and read these incredible books. But you have to read and you have to do something. And I really, for me at least, find hope, as tragic as some of the history is. It's also so wonderful and beautiful, right? That you have people who care about community, who care about each other, and have, at least for me, already exhibited a type of world that I want to be a part of and that I know that we can actually be. And so for me, that part of kind of what I do and focusing on the past is because I believe that the past can light a way out of the present darkness. But that requires a lot of us. It requires people of privilege and power to give that up, to lessen that, to give that to others. But it's all possible, and people are already doing it. So I hope that we can amplify those efforts. One of the things that I am for sure of, though, is that we cannot go on like this, right? That something has to change, and that a lot of people and a lot of institutions, political, private, nonprofit institutions, need to do a lot of internal work. And I think we can do that. So yeah, I'll end there.
Well, thank you both. I realize we're out of time, and we could have probably spent all day unpacking many of the issues, both historical and future looking. I'd really like to thank you both for the amazing work that you do, the scholarship, the work in the field, and look forward to continuing the conversation. To the folks who've been watching online, thank you for joining us and for doing your part.